In this video, I would like to talk about my research ethics for my PhD. My doctoral research examined the heritage provision of former security sites in Northern Ireland. I wanted to understand how the history of conflict, or specifically the civil war that took place between the late 1960s and the late 1990s, was told on sites that were connected to political violence. Because one of the primary vehicles for this type of provision is oral history, I worked with a film archive called the Prison's Memory Archive. I wanted to work with them because they had been recognized as an authority on ethical and collaborative practice and partnership. Together, we co-produced a piece of research that I used in my PhD and that they used in reporting to one of their major funders at the time, the National Heritage Lottery Fund. For me, there were two main ethical conundrums. The first was researcher positionality, and the second was situational context. Ethics is always important, but having a rigorous ethical practice when doing research in a highly divided society, particularly one that is transitional or post-conflict, is essential. It is essential for not inflicting damage or compromising the safety of the people that you do research with. Marie Smith states of doing research in highly divided societies that, quote, conducting research in a manner that uses people as objects without due regard to their subjectivity, their needs, and the impact of the research on their situation is ethically questionable. So for me, the main ethical issue became developing protocols for sensitivity to the subject and also developing strategies for co-producing knowledge with research partners. In many ways, this revolved around addressing the issue of positionality, specifically my positionality as a researcher. I am a white middle-class woman from the United States of America. I was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1972, where I lived until I was 17, when I moved with my family to Brussels, Belgium for 2 years. I returned to the United States in 1991, where I lived until 2012. I grew up following the news coverage in Northern Ireland during the conflict, in no small part because my father was involved with other academics who were engaged with the peace process there. However, I had never traveled there until 2013. The position I occupied as a researcher was more significant in some situations than others, but it did always influence how my research partners related to me and how I related to them. It influenced the knowledge constructed and the frames through which I interpreted meaning. The primary concern I had in developing my research practice was to develop a rigorous sensitivity to the social, political, and cultural context of Northern Ireland. In establishing an ethical research practice, I took to heart advice from John Brewer, who says, quote, during fieldwork, it is essential that ethical practice is maintained, whether through conventional ethical codes, localized ethical knowledge, or a combination of both. But ethical practice within the limits of the law and within the constraints imposed by the risk of the setting. Post-fieldwork, ethical practice requires consideration given towards publication, dissemination, and writing style, as well as discharging the ethical responsibility of returning something back to respondents. I am also particularly indebted to both the scholarship and conversations I had with Les Bach in establishing protocols and a sensibility for reflective practice and research. What I sought to construct as a guiding principle for my ethical practice was to share authority and combine critique with dialogue. This extends to both data collection and analysis. I wanted to foster what Les calls an attentiveness to, quote, discursive and rhetorical moves utilized to both enunciate and legitimate a particular view of the world by both research partners and the researcher. In this sense, for me, ethical research practice is as much about engaged listening to and with the other as it is engaged listening to and with oneself. Because of the topic of my research and the sites under study, I assumed that my research partners would have strong feelings about the subject and the sites, particularly those who have personal history with the sites prior to their closure. I was particularly cautious in containing the scope of my questions when I spoke with individuals who were politically motivated former prisoners, former prison guards, or former soldiers. Given both the history of the locations and the continued volatility of the political climate in Northern Ireland, there was an obvious need for clear ethical guidelines for all aspects of research design, research implementation, and research dissemination. This was of strategic importance in order to respect and protect the moral and legal rights of my research partners and the organizations that were involved directly and indirectly. By undertaking a democratic research practice, all research partners were treated as collaborators, which required developing a research practice that was based on sensitivity, respect, and accountability. I considered that it was critical and crucial that there was transparency at all stages of the research project, as well as adopting an attitude that did not judge the content of the data that evolved or the subject from which the data emerged. This does not mean abandoning a critical practice. It means framing that critique in language and action that is reflexive and responsible to the consequences and circumstances of the broader political and social context in which that analysis will coexist. This is particularly cogent in the wake of Boston College, which has colloquially been referred to as the Boston College Affair or the Boston College subpoenas. The Boston College Affair refers to the 2001 oral history project called the Belfast Project that was conducted with former members of Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries that was directed by Ed Maloney and archived at Boston College. This became the subject of intense controversy as tapes and transcripts were subpoenaed in 2011 by the Prison Service of Northern Ireland. John Brewer has commented that the impact of Boston College is threefold. Peace and conflict researchers need to be cautious and judicious in what they promise. Second, they need to be open and honest in how they outline the risks faced by respondents. And third, they need to be careful in how they publish results and the way they write in order to protect against harm. Several of my research partners explicitly stated that both they and the organizations to which they belong have become much more critical of academic research, as well as more cautious in regards to participating in said research because of the Boston College Affair. This means that rigor in the ethical practice of research is under intense scrutiny in Northern Ireland and makes establishing trust of particular importance. Moreover, this reflects what Kevin Gillen and Jenny Pickerel identify as a crucial component to an ethical research practice. Quote, recognition of our location within the broader dynamics of society and seeking to reflectively critique and adjust that positionality. In this regard, I was particularly fortunate to have benefited from dialogue and association with the director of the Prison's Memory Archive, who is highly regarded for his practice. Additionally, there exists a sort of research fatigue in Northern Ireland, a subject that all of my research participants did mention. Part of this is the perception that was raised frequently to me by politically motivated former prisoners that academic researchers do not engage in a reciprocal practice with their quote-unquote subjects. By this, I mean that the knowledge that is produced is not exchanged. There is more take than give in the dynamics of the research relationship. Although I feel I was only partially successful in addressing this, I did give transcripts and/or indexes with copies of digital recordings to all of the research partners who consented to being recorded. I did extend my services as a researcher and my research to all my research partners. Other than the Prison Memory Archive, 2 of my PhD research partners directly took this up, and another has become a long-term research and writing partner. For example, I was asked to participate as an advisory board member by Quaistia on their oral history project, Irish Republican Prison Craft, Making Memory and Legacy. One issue that I had not anticipated was the impact this research would have on me emotionally and the degree to which it challenged me intellectually. I took great care to plan for the vulnerability of my research partners, but I had not, upon entering fieldwork, taken into consideration the effect it would have on me. Although I had worked with incarcerated youth in the United States during the mid-90s, the issue of imprisonment in Northern Ireland were contingent to a completely different set of social and political histories. The brutality of political violence related to imprisonment, both for prisoners and prison staff, and the experience of political violence that impacted the general population, as well as the continuing impact of sectarian division, was, to say the least, emotionally overwhelming. Fortunately, I was able to adapt resources to process the complex emotions that were evoked by my research. The key to that was the generosity of my research partners and the friends that I made while I was living there. In thinking back on my research practice in my PhD, I realized that my research partners were critical to all aspects of it. I relied upon them to help me process my emotional response to experiences. I relied upon them to help me develop protocols in carrying out data collection, particularly observation and interviewing. And I also relied upon them to help me reflect on how to incorporate my combined affective experiences into a rigorous and reflective analysis of data. In addition, I had to develop mechanisms to remain empathetic and critical in analyzing my findings, to respect the diverse range of perspectives that emerged from my data. The critical elements were to both pursue open dialogue and to share authority. Explicitly, I adhere to the ethical protocols developed by the director of the Prison's Memory Archive, Cathal McLaughlin. In a book about documentary filmmaking in divided societies, Cathal wrote, quote, "The most important protocol, and from which most others flow, is that the research partners are collaborators, and they retain a veto over the material and its exhibition," end quote. The information that I included in my thesis and will subsequently publish has been given to individual research partners for approval. They maintain editorial control over their own content. Honoring the principle of reciprocity and acknowledging the relationship that develops over the course of the project is also critical to ethical practice. In conclusion, I believe this strategy was both flexible and rigorous enough to ensure ethical conduct.